Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about managing cloud computing costs, which might be one of the most obscure, mysterious topics in the entire world of enterprise IT. To discuss that, I'm joined by two people who know a lot about the topic. With me is Bernard Golden, Executive Technical Advisor at VMware. Bernard, tell me I'm getting your title right.
You have the title correct.
Fantastic. And by the way, it's a fairly new gig, is it not? Congratulations on that gig.
Yeah, I've been with VMware about 2 months now.
Okay.
And just to provide a little bit of background and sort of
Please.
finish the anecdote I was telling you.
Yeah.
So we work with very important customers, strategic customers for VMware who are looking to do digital transformations. And I sort of use as a background, and I quote Warren Buffett. He's got this very famous saying, you only know who's swimming naked when the tide goes out. Right. And typically that means who's taken on too much debt or something like that.
Yeah.
In the context that we're talking, what happens a lot of times is organizations say, we're tired of the old slow ways we've been doing things. We're going to shift out of data centers to cloud. They start using one of the cloud providers and they go, how come our applications aren't getting out any faster? Why isn't the magic happening? And that's the tide going out moment when they sort of confront their application practices haven't improved or modernized to match the pace of the cloud. And so that's what we work with organizations to do, is sort of say, how do you transform your application practices? How do you build automated pipelines? How do you get the skills across your organization, build an SRE practice?
Yep.
That's the kind of role that I've stepped into.
Fantastic. That sounds like a great gig, actually, and good for you in particular. Also with you today is Joe Weinman, consultant, author of Cloudnomics. Hello to you, Joe. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. And I think it's only fair to say that Bernard also has a long history, including writing a number of best-selling books in cloud and being generally a luminary. So it's not just like he stepped into this role 2 months ago and, out of the blue.
It's not like he was wandering around San Francisco sort of panhandling and suddenly he got hired by VMware. No, he has a history in enterprise IT. It's true. As do you yourself, Mr. Weinman.
Yes.
Very good. And Cloudnomics, if you can give us, the 11-second version, what is Cloudnomics, the book Cloudnomics, what does it cover?
I don't know if there is an 11-second version because it's a 400-word book, but the basic idea is it covers how to think about cloud costs and benefits. And I know the topic of this session is cost, and cost is certainly important, but not to argue against my own book, but while you can look at costs, and there are examples of optimizations that have been, say 25% of reduction in cost in IT organizations. If an IT organization is 4% of the spend of a company, then a 25% reduction overall, not just for a single application, would at most have a 1% impact. So it's big for the IT organization, but not necessarily big for the company. What I think is equally interesting is not my book Cloudnomics, but a book I did after that called Digital Disciplines, which covers how to use the cloud and sort of the related constellation of technologies, such as social, mobile, IoT, AI, big data, to create strategic competitive advantage. So I'll cover a little bit about that when you give me a chance, but not within the 11 seconds.
Okay, good. On that same note, I think it's interesting, even before we dive truly into the topic of controlling cloud costs and understanding them, is that, the very idea of going to the cloud to save money is really an idea that doesn't make much sense. I mean, it might have been sold that way at one time, but really, it's a necessary competitive tool. It's a more powerful, flexible, effective tool than being in-house. I mean, does anyone really go to the cloud actually to save money? And if so, they may be truly diluted. Bernard, disagree with that?
Well, I think that most organizations have a hard time really grappling with appreciating sort of soft costs or opportunity costs. And so they have an intuition that, gosh, it takes us forever to get new releases of our applications out. That's holding us back from responding to marketplace conditions, responding to, general economic conditions, things like the pandemic. So they have an intuition about that, but it's sort of like, yeah, we could be better. Whereas budget is always easy to measure, right? How much cash went out. And so, in my experience, organizations often focus on the budget stuff to the exclusion of the opportunity costs, not because it's necessarily more important or bigger, but that it's easier.
Right.
And it's kind of
Right.
like the old joke about the drunk looking underneath the street lamp, and somebody says, "What are you doing?" "I'm looking for my keys." "Oh, you lost your keys here?" "No, I lost them 3 blocks away." "Why are you looking here?" "It's easier to see." So, um,
Right.
oftentimes I find that that's the case. Um, and I think there are some organizations who say, "Oh, we're going to go to cloud; it's going to save us a ton of money,"
Mhm.
but they find very commonly that maybe that isn't so much the case. But they do start to see the magic of, oh wow, all of a sudden our pace of things is accelerating. And again, we have
Right.
that pressure. The tide's gone out. How come we're swimming naked? We need to go
Right.
fix those things, and then
Yep.
you start to see pretty significant improvements.
Hmm. Well, Joe, if we dig into the topic of actual cloud costs, I know obviously there's this thing called cloud, but it's divided into these various arbitrary divisions, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, edge, even microservices. I mean, if you look at each one of those, as an idea, is there cost advantages or trade-offs at any one of those topics?
Funny you should ask that. As it happens, I may
Yes.
have some things to share
Good.
with you. If I can have Bernard, if you'll forgive me, and I can just talk for a few minutes. So the stuff I'd like to cover, I was a cloud economics editor for IEEE Cloud Computing Magazine for its entire 5 or 6 year duration. I just want to cover a few highlights there, recognizing though, as I said earlier, and as Bernard also said, that I want to be consonant with the sort of topic of the webinar, which is on cloud costs, and not say, well, actually, cloud costs don't matter, because they do. But I also want to talk about the strategic factors a little bit. So you asked about cloudonomics earlier. I'll touch on that, and then I want to cover sort of some of the write-ups that are available to anyone with IEEE Explore. You can go in and dig up the articles that I just kind of did some screen caps of. So the first thing is talking about hybrid cloud economics. There's a weird effect that happens, and that weird effect is that if you take a pure private cloud, it might cost something like this. And if you take a pure public cloud, it might cost a little bit less, and a hybrid can often be optimal. And there's a variety of hybrids, and there's arguments one way or another about how to think about them. But the obvious question is how do I combine, in effect, something that costs what a Lamborghini does, and then something what costs what a BMW 7 Series does, and end up with something taking parts from both of them that's only the cost of a Kia. So
Right.
the answer is basically, as you can see from some of the basic equations, if you assume that first of all, if public cloud costs less in terms of resources and their unit costs, with all other things being equal, then of course it's a smart thing to do. Or if you don't have the competence, right? I always think about two guys in a pizza shop. They're not going to open a data center behind the oven, so that they can do lots of invoices, for 2 slices of pizza.
Sure.
So, but if you assume that public costs more, but that there is variable demand, no performance differences, et cetera, then public can cost less. And basically, a hybrid cloud subject to networking costs that uses private for things that are not very variable, and on-demand resources for things that are, can achieve an economic optimum. Okay, so that's the general argument. Obviously, everyone's individual conditions are different.
Right. Right. So
The
there's
next
an
thing I just want to
advantage.
touch
It's an
upon
advantage to
briefly
hybrid. In other words, what you're saying, you can actually combine the
is
two and get
there's
and get a
often
cost
an
benefit.
advantage to hybrid.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
Good.
Okay. But again, hybrid may not be feasible because you may not have the time to build your own data centers, or you may not want to own those capital assets. So, everyone has a different case, which is why I'm sure Bernard does a lot of exciting work with clients. But just to talk about multi-clouds for a second, to cover two factors there. The first thing is, if you imagine that usually you shop at Costco and buy avocados there, but your local Kroger's or ShopRite has avocados on sale, and so you might go and get them while you're there. The point is that when you have a number of different providers, and they're each executing a dynamic pricing strategy for resources, at any given time, one may be less than the other. And so if you can select between them, then what you can do is, in effect, you could say arbitrage those prices. And it turns out that it's easy to model using the theory of order statistics. And it doesn't take very many options to get the expected value of the cost down. In other words, if you can only buy avocados at Costco and their price varies a little bit, then the expected value is here. If it's either Costco or ShopRite, and at any given time, one may be less than the other, then order statistics tells you that you'll save 2/3 in the case of this uniform distribution. And basically that peters out. So having 100 providers to choose from is really no different than having 10 providers in the real world. There are some other issues, though, including the cost of failure, where if you think about cloud outages, and cloud people don't like to talk about that, but they happen with every major provider, then it turns out that if you assume like 3 nines availability, say, then the probability in effect goes from the idea that you're likely to have an outage sooner or later to the idea that it's unlikely that with 2 providers that you're going to get a simultaneous outage. So it makes sense from not just a cost optimization, but also a reliability optimization to have more than one provider. And obviously there's lots of different strategies you can use, including, different regions, different availability zones, different providers, diverse network routes and so forth to protect against things.
Before you go to the 10 laws of Fogonomics, so can I interrupt you for 1 second here? I just want to make sure that I get Bernard's thought. Is there anything there that you see like radically right or wrong on that, Bernard? If you look at some of the very interesting thoughts, I like the idea of like the different marketplaces. I mean, anything there that Bernard that really strikes you?
Well, I guess the thing that I always consider is sort of what is the talent set of the organization, and having applications that are designed for and can be fastly operated in multiple cloud environments is typically quite challenging for most organizations. In fact, many organizations really, it's a full-time job getting their stuff running in one cloud provider. And so it's challenging for them to really have the ability to span those things. I did a lot of research on this because I was responsible for multi-cloud. Before I joined VMware, I recently worked at Capital One, which is a bank that's famously all in on using AWS. But I was asked to look, for just the reasons that Joe just outlined, to look at multi-cloud. And I did a tremendous amount of research, talked to many organizations, and I really only found like less than a handful that had a really active multi-cloud strategy. I did find many organizations that had a multi-cloud strategy that I sort of characterize as like, I eat some meals at McDonald's and I eat some meals at Burger King. I have a multi-food strategy. I mean,
because I've seen the graph. Something like 67 or 70% of companies claim to be multi-cloud. So it seems like there's a lot of people who claim to be a multi-cloud.
Right. And that means they built some applications and deploy them into Azure. They build some, they put them into Google.
Right.
Those applications don't necessarily span those kinds of things for challenges they run into. And you can get a significant part of the benefit that Joe outlined with that sort of approach, but avoid the how do I architect an application that really can operate at great efficiency across 2 rather dissimilar environments.
Yeah, so we could talk about like a multiple cloud versus a multi-cloud, right? Which is best in breed for services, right? So I'm using Google for mail, and I'm using, Cloudflare for something else for security and DDoS. And so that sort of workflow enablement, or picking and choosing best in breed, is probably what everyone does, right? Including all of us as consumers, right? We use
Right.
Facebook and we use, Gmail.
Sure.
That is certainly the case. This is just looking at, again, little picture just around specifically cost optimization issues. And there are companies that do this for reliability, as I mentioned in the second slide, or for at least the opportunity to negotiate arbitrage. There's every different thing. So I agree that it's complicated. Next thing, though, just on edge computing briefly, it talked about, this is another article you can pull up on Explore. And so without going into a lot of depth on this, I just want to talk about back in 2012, when Cloudonomics came out, I wrote about trade-offs between sort of hyperscale consolidation and edge dispersion. And everyone said I was crazy and didn't understand how the public cloud worked. And of course, now, almost a decade later, edge is the hottest thing. The math hasn't really changed, right? And so there are kind of a couple of things that are worth considering, one of which is things like backhaul transport costs. I'm on the advisory board of a company called EdgeX, and actually we're just talking about some interesting examples where IoT sensors are collecting massive amounts of data at the edge. And of course, one thing you could do with that is carry all that data back to a hyperscale facility. But very often you're trying to do something like image processing that can be done at the edge. And so the compute costs don't change, but the storage and data transport costs are massively decreased through edge computing. There are other trade-offs, for example, utilization, where there are statistical multiplexing benefits through that utilization, through improvements in utilization through stat muxing. And this is, one of the ways that hyperscale providers generate advantaged economics, is through the idea that I take everyone's different workloads, and some are high while others are low while others are high. And by putting them all together, I get a smoothing effect. And the more workloads that are independent that I aggregate, the greater the smoothing, therefore the higher the utilization, therefore the lower the delivered unit cost. So all that is great. And there are some interesting trade-offs that you get into when you talk about the edge. But if you can have multi-tenancy at the edge, then that is particularly beneficial in achieving these stat muxing, utilization, aggregation kind of benefits. Last thing that I want to cover, or maybe I should keep quiet and.
I appreciate that, Joe, because I want to make sure we cover.
Sure.
It looks like you're right on track there. There's a core question, I think, of this discussion, and that is, what are some concrete steps if companies are saying, hey, we want to manage our cloud costs better? What can we do? Bernard, what sort of advice would you give to that company? We want to know where the money's going and why it's going there. What can we do?
Well, I mean, the old cliche is you can only manage what you measure. And so the first thing is measure what your costs are. And there's a variety of tools or services that you can use that will basically examine your bills, your accounts, and sort of go, you're spending this much money on X, you're spending this much money on Y, you're spending this much on Z. And then you can start to think about, okay, why is, where are the areas I'm spending money on, and what can I do to, manage those efficiently? Because the thing is, you don't necessarily want to spend the least. You want to spend the least to get the most value.
Right. That's
so
the trick.
It's not necessarily a how little can I spend. It's how little can I spend to get what I want from this cloud thing, which has all these capabilities and characteristics like elasticity and so forth. Mm-hmm. I mean, a first step is always just look for the stupid stuff. Like, you've created a lot of volumes. You don't have them attached to machines. They're not serving data, but you're still paying for them. Well, shut them off and get rid of them. Another place that people commonly look at is you have lots of instances, virtual machines running, that are all running at 2% utilization. Well, that's a clear case that you've bought too big a basket for the amount of goods you're putting into it. Maybe you should be shrinking the size of the instance.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can ultimately go to more sophisticated things, which is, sort of how do I maybe design my application so that it responds well to sort of transient changes in traffic where I need a lot of capacity. But when those transient pieces fall down, the load goes down, I can shed some of those computing resources and still have the application up and running, but just with less resource devoted to it. And so those are the kinds of things that you look at. So the first thing is measure it.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is to look for the obvious things that you can take that are sort of like don't require a lot of insight. Then the third is start to examine your bill and your application architecture and so forth to see if you can design for a more efficient use of the resources.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a lot of companies that are out there that are going, we're not sure where our cloud bill is going to be and we're not sure why it is? I mean, is there mass confusion around cloud costs or not necessarily? I think companies are fairly clear usually.
Well, I'll tell you an anecdote that happened, and this is a number of years ago, so I don't want to make it sound like it's universal.
Right.
But I was talking to the CIO of a very large company, and they were just starting to explore using cloud. He said, we got going and it was fantastic. Our developers could get resources immediately, no waiting around. He goes, in the first month, the developer was, really happy, doing a lot of stuff, and the bill came in, it's like $400, which is fantastic.
Right.
He goes, the second month came, we got a bill for $10,000.
Right.
And he said, now we're a big company, we can afford $10,000, but you kind of want to know what caused that extra $9,600.
Right.
And I think what happens a lot of times is people put things into cloud and haven't necessarily modeled what they think it's going to be or what their expectation should be.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's kind of like, I'm not sure. And so they're surprised when they get it. And then they, sort of go, and then ultimately, like you can bet that CIO said, I think we should go probe on what that developer's doing or what things we're doing.
Right.
Drive that bill. And then you start saying, well, what are the things we can shut off, et cetera.
Yeah. Joe, you looks like you were going to
to
chime in
just
with
answer
the economics of serverless, right? Or if you had a point on that, please.
Well, yes, but I was just going to mention for a second, the fact that there are so many third-party companies that do cloud cost management is probably a good indicator of how widespread the problems are with exactly the kinds of things that Bernard was talking about, right? So, too many instances, they're not shut off, an administrator leaves the company, larger instances than you actually need, poor utilization, et cetera.
Sure.
So I want to cover something that is thanks to Adam Ivy. And in fact, Bernard, I think one of the last times I saw you was in Shanghai for Cloud Connect. And Adam was a speaker either at the one we were at or a different one. And I loved his presentation. So we did an article together. And the interesting insight there is that if you look at per hit pricing for things like for microservices or serverless functions or Lambda functions, you end up with a model that looks like this. Now, this data is a little bit out of date, so don't take it, but it's an example of exactly how complicated the equations are when you start thinking about free hits, memory usage, duration of memory for what utilization. So this assumes like 50 millisecond or something like that, that you're using per hit. I guess it's 100 milliseconds per hit here in this example. And you start multiplying by the number of hits, you end up with a cost for hits, you end up with a cost for memory usage, and that's before you get into other costs like data transport. And so bottom line on that is, in a way, something obvious, which is if you just want to have a few sips of wine, it's a smart idea to just buy the glass rather than the bottle. But if you're drinking cask loads, then you may want to buy the winery, rather than buying the wine by the glass. And so you end up with this kind of situation where serverless can make sense at low hits per second, but in the kind of quantities that a large company, in this case Disney, was dealing with, the costs basically favor more of a dedicated infrastructure rather than using serverless. So let me stop there, and then I'll just get into one last slide if I can.
Bernard, did you have any thought about the idea of serverless and whether or not it works for different sizes of company? I would think it's a fairly universal. It's going to work for most companies. What is your take on that?
Well, I think Joe is exactly right, which is it's really depends on the application and the application characteristics, application traffic. There's a lot of strengths to serverless. For example, you don't have to worry about utilization or capacity at all. Basically, the provider makes a pledge that no matter how much traffic you send to it, it will figure out a way to start enough instances to get good response times. So there's attractive aspects of that. On the other hand, if you throw in a lot of traffic, you can end up spending quite a bit. I see Star has decided to come back and make another visit to me.
Star is the kitty who knows the most about cloud. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, she's finished her late morning nap and isn't quite ready for her early afternoon nap, and so is ready for some attention.
All right.
And so, so that's the sort of trade-offs. And, this is, I think this sort of matching architectures and usage patterns and cost structures is going to be a pretty important strength going forward for organizations, because this is the new paradigm of compute. And I'll say several companies like HPE,
right,
and Dell, for example, have started to offer plans where they say, we will put hardware onto your site, but you only pay for it as you use it. So the old model of fixed cost, buying capital investment on-prem and OpEx, even that's breaking down. So it's this sort of matching usage and capacity and loads and all that cost, as well as the value side. We haven't really talked a ton about the value side, but there's a reason companies have embraced cloud, and it's often because they need to get applications out, they need to provide functionality quickly, they need to make more frequent changes, they have high variation in traffic. So, and that's all associated with the value side, typically. What value do you get from the application? You need to put that piece into it too. Because in the abstract, you might say, well, I'll just choose a lower cost thing, but it might be choosing that path, you're forfeiting customer satisfaction or additional revenues or something like that. So this discipline of cost, value, architecture, the intersection of all those things, I think is going to be a really important IT capability in the going forward.
Well, one follow-up on that, Bernard, I think it's really interesting. You mentioned HPE, and of course they're doing GreenLake. It's, IT as a service, and as you mentioned, they're wrenching you the gears you needed. I personally would never have predicted back in 2012, where cloud was mushrooming forth, that even in the year 2021, someone would still be in the business of renting hardware to be on location. I mean, would you have thought that we'd still be talking about that in 2021 back in, say, 2012? Is that slightly counter trend?
Well, it sounds like Joe believes it or thought of it or something. So maybe you can take a crack at it first, Joe.
Joe, what's your take?
So yeah, I mean, that's what I've always said. People said hybrid is just a transition on the way to pure public, and there's various well-known luminaries that talk about the evolution from bespoke to custom to standard to everything goes to service. But we don't see that in any other industry. And every industry has equivalent of owned resources or get it as a service. You can buy a car, you can take a taxi, you can buy a plane, you can, get a seat on a plane, for a ride. And the example that was used back almost 20 years ago was electricity, with the idea being, well, yes, look how electricity went from being, generated on premises with Burden's water wheel and so forth to it's only a utility service. And that's come back. People, have their own private generation capabilities through windmills or solar panels or so forth. So every place in the world you look, people have that are thinking rationally have determined that there's an economic optimum in private resources coupled with public on-demand resources. And so, the cloud, I never thought was any different, and I wrote extensively about it at the time. So, there's obviously broader issues. Again, the pizzeria example, that, there's no competence. Companies that want to focus on their core competence and not worry about IT operations are another example. So there's plenty of great reasons to go to the cloud or the edge as a service. But for many companies with the competence and the scale, it can make sense to maintain their own infrastructure, whether it's in a co-location facility, a data center, or where have you.
You're really saying the war is over and hybrid cloud is won?
I think the war is over at heterogeneous architectures, and it's what I call the hybrid multi-cloud fog, which is hybrids of private and public, hybrids of multiple public, either for workflow enablement at the SaaS layer or for infrastructure arbitrage, and hybrids of cloud and edge and the fog in between, based on where things optimally belong. And so there's no simple one-size-fits-all solution, I don't believe, for many clients.
I'm thinking of there's probably this younger company that say they do travel booking. Not that anyone does travel, something like that, and they're small and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. And they launched some in the last 5 years or so. They were cloud only to begin with, and a lot of these younger startups were cloud only to begin with, and they'll never want to have a data center, even though if they were launched in like 1957, they finally would have gotten their own machines. But isn't there an entire generation of companies coming up that goes, what? Own our own data center? Come on, we wouldn't do that.
I'm sure there are, but I'm sure also that there are those companies that have grown and switched strategies, right? So a good example is Instagram started off with managed services. The managed service provider couldn't add capacity quickly enough, so they moved to Amazon. And then what happened is after the acquisition, they were integrated in with Facebook's own enterprise servers, which is, yes, Facebook is a cloud, but they run their own data centers, right?
Right.
So, anything and everything is possible. Those that stay pure cloud native, those that stay in data centers. Zynga is an example of a company that wasn't its own data center, that started in the cloud, right? Then went to its own data centers because they determined that the mix of performance gains as well as unit cost differentials made that make sense. And then as they started to unfortunately decline, they said, uh-oh, now we have all this unutilized owned capacity. We should have, go back to the cloud. So it's all options are possible.
What about the idea, and Bernard, I think you had brought this up, the idea of cloud repatriation? In other words, the application goes back in-house. Is that what that is? And how does that relate to cost, if it does?
Well, in the industry, you often hear, excuse me if I just coughed. I tried to put myself on mute, maybe not successfully. Well, there's discussion in the industry about, you've taken an application, you put it in the cloud, and you found it's too expensive. Now you're going to move it back on-prem. And I brought it up because, before I was working at VMware, and I wasn't working at Capital One either, I wrote a piece that was sort of critical of this phenomena, this putative phenomena, and I actually had a couple of vendors call me up and say, "Oh no, it really happens." And I said, "Okay, well, I want to learn. Obviously, if I was wrong, I want to for my thing." And they both put forward like a sample set of one. They could each point to one customer of theirs. Okay. And my experience is within IT organizations, it's typically a tremendous amount of work to get an application deployed somewhere. Right. Not only do you have to build it or whatever that is, that's the engineering sort of thing, but there's a whole range of things that you do when you deploy it. You've got to figure out, do I have the security in place? Do I have the compliance? You have to do these reviews. So a lot of organizational overhead, friction, and I'm not trying to say it's not necessary, but there's a lot of effort. Mm-hmm. You get it someplace, to make the decision to move it, you've got to say, I'm going to revisit all of those things that were a tremendous amount of investment and redo those to do that. And most organizations tend to just say, you know what, we're going to leave it the way it is. And so I don't see much of that repatriation as one hears about.
Uh-huh. But it does, the idea floats around out there in the industry, however mythical it might be.
Yeah, I mean, and there's definitely examples that one can point to. For example, the Zynga thing.
Right.
Dropbox is another company that very famously started with AWS and then concluded that at the scale they were operating and the rather limited set of functionality they needed, it would make more sense to build their own environment. And so they run a lot of their own environment now. Um, you know,
Can I just add to that?
Please, Joe.
Not only do they run their own environment, they built their own hardware. So the Discotheque box is specially performance engineered for what they do.
Hmm. Joe, did you have a closing thought with your slides, digital disciplines? I want to make sure
Yeah, I wanted to cover, just because it's too easy to focus on the cost side. There's lots of other examples of why you do cloud. A big one is speed of innovation, right?
Mhm.
So, and again, looking at this bigger picture, as Bernard mentioned, sort of opportunity costs, not just costs. If you, for example, use the cloud to accelerate your development and testing of a new application or a even embedded functionality within a product that you sell, for example, if you can reduce the time to develop that product, right, by leveraging every tool, including the cloud, at your disposal, what you're doing is you're minimizing the run rate of the costs involved in the development. I'm talking about overall product development, not just application development. And so that big normal product lifecycle curve where you have a big loss in money as you spend on development, and then it takes a while before you hit break even. And then by the way, as you hit profitability, other competitors enter the market with something similar, that product becomes commoditized, and as a result, the profit gets taken out. So if you can minimize the costs and maximize, therefore, the time that you spend when product profitability before commoditization, then you're making a lot of money. In digital disciplines, I covered something else, which is the notion that there are 4 generic strategies. I won't go into all of these, obviously, for the sake of time in depth. But information excellence is basically using information to achieve operational excellence. So to do process management, process optimization, digital fusion or twinning, monetization of data that is exhaust data from the process, et cetera. Solution leadership is basically what we see today with more smart digital connected products, where the product itself ties to applications in the cloud. And that could be, for example, your Fitbit together with your health trend application. Collective intimacy, think Netflix with their recommendation engine, or Amazon.com with upsell, cross-sell, and accelerated innovation, things like idea markets and innovation networks and so forth. So all of these are revenue generating business strategies. All of them also require IT and therefore a heavy cloud / edge / IoT / platform ecosystem nurturing, et cetera, foundational work. So to take collective intimacy as an example, everyone says Netflix runs on Amazon. They don't. Everything before you hit play runs on Amazon. Streaming is actually done at the edge in co-location facilities close to ISPs. But nevertheless, the part that does run in Amazon is a great example of this. If you want to collect lots of data from tens of millions of customers, or now 200 million customers, and be able to process that all to generate recommendations interactively to customers as they're surfing or navigating your quote unquote home page, you need cloud-like functionality. If you're doing information excellence, you probably need collection of data from IoT sensors at the edge that is possibly pre-processed and secured, but then brought up to some central facility for, say, predictive analytics. So the only point is that probably public, possibly private, clouds are important for revenue generating business strategies that are digitally enabled. And that's all I wanted to say.
That's good. All right. I think for the interest of time, I want to close this out, but Bernard, I want to give you a chance to say a last thought, something that you think should be said about cloud costs, the value of cloud, maybe the future of cloud? What is an important thing that we should definitely know about cloud?
Well, I think I'd like to return and sort of reiterate that understanding and having the disciplines of understanding costs,
Mm-hmm.
your application architecture, your operations patterns, having that sort of core set of capabilities and bring them to bear in the service of value out of your applications is going to be a core competence, I believe, going forward. And it's something every organization will be saying, what do we have in place for this? What do we need to develop for this? What kinds of skills do we need to bring into our organization? This is, to use an analogy, I always like analogies. This is just like an auto manufacturer. I mean, auto manufacturers don't merely say how cheaply can we manufacture a car. They've got to have a number of disciplines that are how cheaply, what markets do we have to be in,
Right.
what kinds of things do we have to bring into our cars, for functionality or safety reasons, regulatory reasons, and they've got tremendous skill and disciplines in managing the all of those factors to bring cars with the right functionality at the right price point to the right markets. And I think the same sort of thing is going to be true for IT organizations. They're going to be basically product providers, and they need to develop all of those kinds of skills. And so it's not just how cheaply can we run something, how much can we squeeze cost out of it.
Right. So it's a far more complex question than what is the cheapest thing we can do. Right. All right. Well, Joe, Bernard, I greatly appreciate your expertise. I definitely learned something. I'll send you the link when we're done and we can all tweet it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.